The forest of Oakhaven did not wake up all at once. It woke up in layers, like a sleeper slowly shedding blankets. First came the silver-gray light that turned the dew into liquid pearls, then the first low flute note of the morning thrush, and finally, the scent of warming pine needles. Deep within the base of a hollowed cedar tree lived Thistle. Unlike the elders who preferred the deep, stony silence of the low roots, Thistle lived mid-trunk. Her home was accessible via a series of winding, moss-covered spiral stairs that hugged the bark of the great tree. Her windows were portholes made of translucent dragonfly wing glass, tinted a soft amber that made every morning look like the height of autumn. Thistle was a root collector. It was her job to find the singing roots, the tiny hair-like fibers that grew toward the surface when the earth was particularly happy. These roots were used to brew the tea of clarity that the council drank during the long nights of the new moon. This morning, Thistle's amber lantern, a small, hollowed-out gourd filled with bioluminescent firefly moss, was flickering with a strange, frantic rhythm. It wasn't the steady glow of a contented forest. It was a nervous pulse. She sat at her small table, carved from a single piece of driftwood, and poured herself a mug of warm hazelnut milk. Outside, the forest felt heavy. Not the heaviness of an approaching storm, but a weight of expectation. The great oak, the ancestor of all trees in Oakhaven, had stopped dropping its acorns 3 days early. In the world of gnomes, nature's schedule was more reliable than any clock, and a 3-day silence was an eternity. Thistle reached for her collection bag. It was made of soft badger leather, reinforced with spider silk stitching. Inside, she kept her tools, a small silver trowel, a pair of cedarwood tweezers, and a collection of scent jars used to categorize the different moods of the soil. She stepped out onto her porch. The air was cool and tasted of damp ferns. Looking down, the forest floor was a sea of emerald and shadow. To a human, it was just a woods. To Thistle, it was a sprawling city of interconnected lives. She could see the ant highways shimmering in the light and the fairy rings where the mushrooms held their nightly meetings. "Morning, old friend," Thistle whispered, patting the bark of the cedar. The tree gave a low, resonant hum in response, but beneath the hum, Thistle felt a shiver. A cold current was moving through the sap. She began her descent. Instead of taking the stairs, she used the dew slide, a smooth, sap-coated groove in the bark that gnomes used for quick travel. She slid down, the wind whistling past her pointed green hat, landing softly in a patch of marshmallow moss at the base. Her goal today was the Whispering Well, a place where the roots of the forest converged. If the trees were shivering, the roots would know why. As she set off, her boots making a soft thwip, thwip on the damp leaves, she noticed a single blue jay feather floating in the air. It didn't fall to the ground. It stayed suspended, spinning slowly in a circle, as if caught in a localized whirlpool of air. Thistle watched it, her brow furrowed. "The winds are braiding," she murmured, "and when the winds braid, the seasons begin to tangle." She checked her compass, a small bowl of water with a floating needle made of a magnetized thorn. The needle wasn't pointing north. It was spinning, slowly and purposefully, in time with the blue jay feather. The adventure hadn't even truly begun, and already the forest was asking questions that Thistle wasn't sure she could answer. Thistle followed the spinning thorn compass deeper into the heart of Oakhaven. The further she moved from her home tree, the more the forest seemed to hold its breath. Even the shadows looked different, long velvet blue fingers that stretched across the path as if trying to catch the light before it vanished. She arrived at the Whispering Well by mid-morning. It wasn't a stone well built by hands, but a natural depression where the roots of 7 different species of trees, oak, ash, thorn, cedar, willow, pine, and birch, all met in a tangled wooden basin. In the center was a pool of water so still it looked like a sheet of black glass. Kneeling at the edge, Thistle didn't look at her reflection. Instead, she dipped her fingers into the water. It was vibrationally loud. The water hummed against her skin, a frantic tat-tat-tat, like a moth beating its wings against a window pane. "Thistle of the mid-trunk," a voice rasped. It sounded like two dry stones grinding together. From beneath a massive moss-covered shelf of fungus, the gatekeeper of the undergreen emerged. He was a gnome of such incredible age that he appeared to be made more of wood than of flesh. His beard was a cascading waterfall of gray lichen, and his hat was the upturned shell of a giant forest tortoise, polished to a dull shine. "Gatekeeper," Thistle greeted him with a respectful bow. "The sap is shivering in the cedar, and the winds are braiding. I have come to collect the singing roots, but the well is restless." The gatekeeper hobbled toward the pool, his staff, a gnarled root of a lightning-struck rowan, clacking on the earth. "Restless? No, child. The well is frightened. Look deeper." He tapped the surface of the water with his staff. The ripples didn't spread outward in circles. They formed geometric patterns, sharp angles and zigzags that defied the nature of liquid. "The seasons have lost their loom," the gatekeeper whispered. "The great weaver who lives in the cloud spindles has dropped her shuttle. Summer is trying to stay, winter is trying to arrive, and autumn is being squeezed thin between them. If the tangle isn't undone, the forest will skip its sleep, and a forest that does not sleep is a forest that forgets how to grow." Thistle felt a cold knot of worry in her stomach. What can a root collector do against the tangle of seasons? The gatekeeper reached into the hollow of his tortoiseshell hat and pulled out a small, shimmering object. It was a silver spindle, no larger than a pine needle, but it glowed with a soft, shifting light, sometimes the gold of summer, sometimes the crisp white of frost. "This is a fragment of the weaver's tool," the gatekeeper said. "It fell into the well last night. You must take it to the High-Vantage, where the sky touches the trees. You must find the threads of the meridian and use this spindle to guide them back into their proper order." "But I am a collector of roots," Thistle protested. "I belong in the dirt, not the clouds." "The roots and the clouds are but two ends of the same string, child," the gatekeeper replied, his amber eyes twinkling with a sudden, sharp intelligence. "Besides, the roots have already told me, your hands are the only ones steady enough to hold the light without burning." He handed her the spindle. The moment Thistle's fingers touched it, she felt a rush of warmth that smelled of sun-warmed hay and a chill that smelled of coming snow. It was heavy with the weight of time itself. "Follow the amber path," the gatekeeper instructed, pointing his staff toward a section of the forest where the sun hit the fallen leaves, making them glow like molten copper. "And remember, when the path disappears, trust your feet. They know the rhythm of the earth better than your head does." Thistle tucked the silver spindle into her badger leather bag right next to her silver trowel. The small adventure of root collecting had officially transformed into a great weaving. As she stepped onto the amber path, the blue jay feather from earlier landed softly on her shoulder. It felt like a tiny, feathered weight of encouragement. She took a deep breath of the damp, pine-scented air and began her long trek toward the heights of Oakhaven. The amber path was not a fixed trail, but a trick of the light. It was a golden road that existed only where the sun managed to pierce through the thick canopy of the great oak, illuminating the fallen leaves of the previous autumn. To stay on it, Thistle had to move with the sun, walking in the shifting pools of warmth. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the air began to thicken. A strange, milky haze rolled in from the low damps, the marshy edges of the forest. This was no ordinary mist. It was a vapor veil, and within it, danced the fog moths. These creatures were the size of a gnome's hand, with wings made of translucent, wet silk. They didn't eat leaves or nectar, they fed on direction. As they fluttered around Thistle, their wings beating with a sound like wet laundry snapping in the wind, the path began to blur. The golden leaves beneath her feet turned gray, and the familiar scent of pine and damp earth vanished, replaced by the smell of nothingness. Lost, 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 the moths hummed, their voices a soft vibration that seemed to come from inside her own ears. Thistle stopped. She knew that if she took another 3 steps, she would find herself in the gray between, a pocket of the forest where time stretched and bent. She reached into her badger leather bag and pulled out her wooden rack of scent jars. Gnomes don't just see the world, they smell its history. She uncorked the first jar. Sun-baked granite. A sharp, warm mineral scent filled the air. The fog moths hissed and recoiled, for they hated the smell of things that were solid and unmoving. But the mist was too thick, the scent dissipated too quickly. She uncorked the second jar. Crushed mint and brook water. This was a fresh, biting scent. It cleared Thistle's head, but it didn't reveal the path. Finally, she pulled out a jar labeled in her own neat, tiny handwriting, hearth smoke and dried apple. This was the scent of home. It was the smell of the mid-trunk, of her cedar tree sanctuary and the cozy safety of her driftwood table. As the aroma wafted out, it acted like a magnet. The silver spindle in her bag began to vibrate in sympathy with the scent. The light from the spindle flared, glowing through the leather of her pouch, and the fog moths let out a collective sigh of disappointment. They dissolved back into the mist, unable to feed on someone who knew exactly who and where they were. The scent of home didn't clear the fog, but it turned the mist into a guide. The vapors began to swirl into shapes, vague, ghostly outlines of the trees she knew. "Trust your feet," she whispered, echoing the gatekeeper's words. She closed her eyes. Instead of looking for the amber path, she felt for it. The ground beneath her boots had a specific texture. The path was made of oak leaves, flat, leathery, and firm. To either side lay the mossy bog, soft, yielding, and treacherous. By feeling the crunch of the leaves through her soles, she navigated the vapor veil as if she were walking through her own front door. After an hour of blind walking, the air suddenly snapped cold. The mist vanished, as if a giant hand had swept it away. Thistle opened her eyes and gasped. She was standing at the base of the silver birch spire. This was a tree so tall and so white, it looked like a bone needle stitching the green forest to the blue sky. It marked the beginning of the High-Vantage. But the tree was weeping. Instead of clear sap, a shimmering iridescent fluid was leaking from its bark. And stuck in the sap, struggling to free its wings, was a season sprite, a tiny being made of autumn gold sparks. The sprite's presence here was a bad omen. If the sprites were getting stuck in the sap, it meant the internal clock of the trees was slowing down to a crawl. The silver spindle in Thistle's bag grew hot, almost scorching her hip. She looked up the towering height of the spire. There were no stairs here, only the rough, peeling bark and the dizzying height. "I belong in the dirt," she reminded herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. But then she looked at the trapped sprite, whose gold light was fading into a dull, leaden gray. "But the dirt won't be there if the sky falls down," she added. She reached for her silver trowel, not to dig, but to use as a climbing pick. With a deep breath of the thin, high air, Thistle began her ascent of the silver birch spire. The bark of the silver birch spire was like climbing a mountain made of ancient, brittle parchment. Each time Thistle drove the tip of her silver trowel into a crevice, the tree groaned, a deep, wooden sound that vibrated through her teeth. The iridescent sap was slippery, smelling of fermented starlight and bitter almonds. Thistle reached the trapped season sprite and paused. The tiny creature looked like a dandelion seed caught in amber, its golden sparks flickering out one by one. "Patience, little spark," Thistle whispered. She didn't use force. Instead, she took a small vial of warm squirrel breath, a gentle aromatic oil she'd collected during the spring, and dripped it onto the sap. The warmth dissolved the sticky resin, and with a soft pop, the sprite was free. It didn't fly away. It hovered near her ear, a tiny, glowing companion providing a soft light for her climb. As she reached the wind chambers, the middle canopy where the branches grew thick and horizontal, the world changed. The air here didn't blow, it sang. The wind moved through the hollow branches like breath through a flute, creating a haunting, polyphonic melody. Resting on a branch as wide as a gnome highway, Thistle found herself face to face with the Owl King. He was not a bird of feathers and bone, but a creature of shadow and moonlight. He stood 3 times the height of a gnome, his eyes 2 massive, glowing discs of polished obsidian. His feathers were actually thousands of tiny silver leaves that rustled even when there was no breeze. "Root collector," the Owl King hooted, sound shaking the very branch beneath her boots. "You are far above your station. The dirt is your kingdom. The sky belongs to the dreamers." Thistle stood her ground, though her knees felt like water. She reached into her bag and pulled out the silver spindle. Its light reflected in the Owl King's obsidian eyes, making them look like a night sky filled with falling stars. "The dirt is dying, Majesty," she said, her voice small but clear. "The seasons are tangled, and the great weaver has lost her shuttle. I carry the light of the undergreen to mend the meridian." The Owl King tilted his head, a full 180 degrees. He leaned in close, his beak, a piece of curved ivory, stopping inches from her nose. He sniffed. "You smell of hearth smoke and dried apple," he remarked, his voice softening. "The scent of a gnome who loves the world she lives in. Many come here seeking power, but few come seeking to mend. But the High-Vantage is guarded for a reason. To pass, you must prove you can. See the invisible threads." He spread his massive wings, and the feathers began to spin. The wind chamber was suddenly filled with a swirling kaleidoscope of silver light. The branches seemed to vanish, replaced by a dizzying void. "Find the path that is not there," the Owl King challenged. Thistle didn't panic. She realized this was a trial of perspective. She looked at the silver spindle in her hand. It wasn't just a tool, it was a compass. She remembered the season sprite she had rescued. "Little spark," she whispered, "show me the way the heat moves." The sprite flew forward. It didn't move in a straight line. It followed a hidden current of warmth that snaked through the silver chaos. Thistle followed, not looking at the silver leaves or the terrifying void, but at the tiny golden trail left by the sprite. She walked on what felt like nothing, but every time her boot descended, a branch of the silver birch spire would solidify beneath her. She was walking on the vibration of growth, the path the tree intended to take but hadn't yet grown. Within minutes, she was through the chamber and standing on the very crown of the tree. The Owl King was there, waiting for her, his wings folded. "You have the green sight, Thistle," he said, bowing his head. "The meridian is just above you, where the stars touch the leaves. But be warned, the tangle is not a passive thing. It is a knot of frustrated time, and it will try to pull you into its loop." He plucked a single silver feather from his wing and handed it to her. "Use this as your needle. The spindle provides the thread, the feather provides the direction." Thistle thanked him and looked up. The sky was no longer blue. It was a swirling vortex of deep orange, icy white, and lush green, all the seasons fighting for the same patch of space. She was at the High-Vantage. The real work was about to begin. The High-Vantage was unlike anything Thistle had ever imagined. From her home in the mid-trunk, the sky, was a distant roof. Here, it was a living sea. She stood on the very tip of the silver birch spire, her boots balanced on a cluster of branches that felt as flexible as a bird's nest. Above her, the vortex of seasons roared. It looked like a giant shimmering braid that had come undone at the ends. Strands of summer gold, warm and smelling of dry grass, were whipped into knots with winter blue, biting, sharp, and smelling of ozone. In between them, the green of spring and the copper of autumn were being shredded, their energy leaking out into the atmosphere as time dust, a fine, sparkling powder that made Thistle's skin tingle. "The meridian," she whispered, her voice snatched away by the wind. The meridian was a horizontal line of pure white light that should have been the anchor for these seasonal threads. But the line was sagging, weighed down by the tangle. Thistle reached into her bag. She took the silver spindle in her left hand and the Owl King's feather in her right. The season sprite hovered nearby, acting as a living lantern against the chaotic flashes of the vortex. "I am a root collector," she reminded herself, grounding her spirit. "I know how to untangle the stubborn fibers of the earth. The sky is just a different kind of garden." She stepped off the branch. Thanks to the thin air and the strange gravity of the High-Vantage, she didn't fall. She floated, buoyed by the time dust. She drifted toward the center of the tangle. As she got closer, the temperature began to swing wildly. One side of her face felt scorched by a July sun, while her other shoulder grew numb with January frost. The tangle let out a low, mournful groan. It was a knot of frustrated time. Because the seasons couldn't move forward, they were beginning to eat themselves. Thistle saw the primary knot, a thick, pulsing mass of violet and gray energy where the weaver's shuttle had supposedly been dropped. She used the Owl King's silver feather to probe the knot. The feather glowed, its moonlight energy acting as a surgical tool. "Here," she said, spotting a stray thread of autumn copper that was wrapped 3 times around a shard of winter ice. She touched the silver spindle to the thread. The spindle began to spin, not because of the wind, but because it was drinking in the discord. As it spun, it began to draw out a stabilizing thread of pure, neutral white light. With the precision of a master weaver, Thistle began to stitch. She used the silver feather to hook the summer threads and pull them upward toward the zenith. She looped the winter strands and pushed them toward the nadir. It was exhausting work. Every movement felt like pulling a rope through thick, cold honey. The time dust began to coat her eyelashes, making it hard to see. Suddenly, the tangle fought back. A burst of false spring erupted from the knot, a chaotic surge of growth energy that caused tiny, phantom flowers to bloom and die on Thistle's sleeve in seconds. The surge threatened to knock her back into the void. The season sprite zipped forward, throwing itself into the surge. The tiny creature sacrificed its golden glow to absorb the shock, turning into a dull gray spark as it fell toward Thistle's palm. "No!" Thistle cried. Anger, warm and earthy, rose up in her. She didn't belong in the clouds, but she was a protector of life. She gripped the spindle with both hands and drove it directly into the heart of the primary knot. "The root remembers the bloom!" she shouted, a gnome mantra of balance. "The bloom remembers the seed! The seed remembers the earth!" The spindle let out a blinding pulse of amber light, the color of her own lantern. The vibration was so powerful, it shattered the time dust and forced the seasonal threads to snap back into their proper alignments. The roar of the wind died down to a gentle hum. The sky began to clear, the violet shadows retreating to the horizons. The meridian straightened, glowing with a steady, peaceful, white light. Thistle hung in the air, gasping for breath. In her hand, the little sprite was cold and gray. She tucked it gently into her pocket, near the warmth of her own skin. She looked up. The seasons weren't tangled anymore. They were flowing in a beautiful, slow-motion river. But as she looked toward the distant horizon, beyond the borders of Oakhaven, she saw something that made her heart stop. The forest she knew was just a small island. Beyond it, a great, gray stillness was creeping across the land, a place where no seasons moved at all. Her work at the High-Vantage was done, but the mystery was growing. The weaver hadn't just dropped her shuttle. It looked like she had been forced to leave. The descent from the High-Vantage was far swifter than the climb, but it was filled with an eerie, hollow silence. As Thistle drifted down through the layers of the silver birch spire, she noticed that the iridescent, weeping sap had vanished, but the tree felt different. It felt tired. When her boots finally touched the mossy floor of Oakhaven, she realized the forest she had left that morning was gone. The amber path had solidified into a permanent trail of copper-colored stones, and the trees were no longer shivering. However, the air was unnervingly still. It wasn't the peace of a job well done. It was the stillness of a clock that had been wound too tight. The time dust she had seen in the sky was now settling on the leaves like a fine silver ash. Thistle reached into her pocket. The season sprite was still gray and cold, but as it touched the ground, it gave a tiny, flickering pulse. It didn't fly. It pointed its little translucent head toward the north, where the echo caves lay hidden beneath the roots of the world. "The weaver isn't in the clouds anymore," Thistle whispered. "She's gone to ground." She began the long trek through the drowsy thicket. Here, the bushes were heavy with slumber berries, dark purple fruits that smelled of lavender and old books. Usually, gnomes avoided this area for fear of falling into a nap that lasted a week, but today, the berries were shriveled. Something was drinking the dream sap of the forest. As she walked, Thistle noticed a figure sitting on a stump. It was the gatekeeper, but he looked diminished. His tortoise-shell hat was cracked, and his lichen beard seemed brittle. "You mended the meridian," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "But you only fixed the reflection, child. The source is still broken. The weaver has been pulled into the echo caves by the shadow loom." "The shadow loom?" Thistle asked, kneeling beside him. "I thought that was just a story told to elude the youngsters." "A story is just a truth that's waiting for the right time to happen," the gatekeeper sighed. "The shadow loom is a place of instead of. It is made of the things the forest didn't do. The blossoms that didn't open, the seeds that didn't sprout, the rain that didn't fall. It has grown hungry. It has taken the weaver to weave a season of never was." He handed her a small iron key. It was heavy and felt incredibly cold. "This is the root key. It opens the third door in the caves. If the weaver stays in the shadow loom, she will forget the real forest. She will start to think the gray ash is snow and the silence is song." Thistle took the key. It was a stark contrast to the silver spindle. One was light and sky, the other was heavy and earth. "Why me, gatekeeper?" she asked. "I'm just a root collector." "Because a root collector knows how to find things that are buried," he replied, closing his amber eyes. "And because you carried the scent of hearth smoke. The shadow loom has no smell. To beat it, you must bring the aroma of reality into the heart of the illusion." Thistle set off toward the north. The forest grew darker, the trees taller and more gnarled. The echo caves were located at the base of the Crag-Tooth Mountain, where the earth opened up like a giant, yawning mouth. As she entered the cave, the sound of her own footsteps was amplified 100 times. Thwip, thwip became boom, boom. She took out her amber lantern. The light didn't spread. It was sucked into the darkness as if the shadows were drinking it. She followed the sound of a rhythmic, mechanical clack, whir, clack. It was the sound of a loom, but it was hollow, lacking the heartbeat of life. She reached the third door, a massive slab of obsidian. She inserted the root key. The door didn't creak open. It dissolved into a puddle of gray ink. Thistle stepped through. She was no longer in a cave. She was in a vast gray hall where thousands of invisible shuttles were flying through the air, weaving a tapestry of dust and fog. In the center sat a woman made of starlight and thread, her fingers moving frantically. This was the Great Weaver, but her eyes were clouded over with gray film. "One more row," the weaver muttered. "One more row of never was, and the silence will be complete." Thistle reached for her scent jars. She knew that words wouldn't reach the weaver, but the memory of a warm kitchen might. The shadow loom did not have a floor. It felt as if Thistle were standing on a stretched fabric of solidified fog. Every time the Great Weaver's shuttles flew, clack, whir, clack, the gray hall expanded, pushing the walls of the real world further away. The weaver herself was a tragic sight. Her hair, once a vibrant river of silver light, was now matted with the gray ash of time dust. Her fingers were bleeding ink, and her eyes were fixed on a pattern that made no sense, a landscape of trees with no leaves and rivers with no water. "Great Weaver," Thistle called out. The weaver didn't blink. "The pattern must be finished," she droned. "If there is no growth, there is no decay. If there is no decay, there is no pain. I am weaving a world of perfect, motionless safety." Thistle realized the shadow loom wasn't born of malice, but of exhaustion. The weaver had grown tired of the endless cycle of the seasons, the messy, painful struggle of life, and the shadow loom had offered her a shortcut to stillness. "The safety of a stone is the death of the seed," Thistle whispered. She reached into her bag. The silver spindle was cold now, its skylight smothered by the gray ink of the hall. She looked at her rack of scent jars. She knew that to wake the weaver, she had to remind her of the smell of a world that was worth the pain of living. Thistle didn't pick just one jar. She opened 3 at once. First, she released Earth After Rain. The sharp, petrichor scent of wet soil and ozone filled the gray hall. The invisible shuttles faltered, their rhythmic clicking missing a beat. Second, she released Wild Berry Jam. A thick, sweet, bubbling aroma of summer heat and sticky fruit wafted toward the loom. The weaver's nose twitched. A single spark of silver returned to her clouded eyes. Finally, Thistle opened the most powerful jar of all. The first breath of spring. It was a scent that held the smell of melting snow, waking moss, and the tiny green shout of a sprout breaking through the frost. The gray tapestry began to shiver. "The smell," the weaver gasped, her fingers trembling. "I remember the dirt. It was cold, but it was alive." "It's still there," Thistle said, stepping forward, "but it needs its weaver. The seasons are flowing, but they have no one to tuck them into bed at night." The shadow loom sensed its grip was slipping. The gray ink on the floor began to rise up like a tidal wave, forming into a giant, faceless figure, the architect of Instead Of. It was a towering mass of unsprouted seeds and unkept promises. "Stay," the figure boomed, its voice a vacuum that sucked the air from Thistle's lungs. "In the stillness, nothing fades." The wave of gray ink crashed toward them. Thistle didn't have a sword or a shield. She had her silver trowel. She didn't swing it at the shadow. Instead, knelt and drove the trowel through the gray fabric of the floor. She wasn't trying to fight the shadow. She was trying to reach the true root beneath the illusion. "The dirt is never still!" Thistle shouted. As the trowel pierced the floor, a surge of real, brown, messy earth erupted upward. It wasn't pretty. It was mud and stones and tangles of hairy roots, but it was real. The scent of the earth combined with the aromas from the jars, creating a sensory explosion. The architect of Instead Of let out a scream of pure nothingness as the reality of the root tore through its ink. The weaver stood up, her starlight hair flaring with new brilliance. She grabbed her own shuttle, the real one, which had been buried under the gray ash, and threw it across the hall. It didn't weave fog. It wove a streak of vibrant autumn gold. "I am the weaver of the world," she declared, her voice like a chime. "And the world is not finished." With a sound like a great sheet of glass shattering, Shadowloom dissolved. Thistle found herself back in the echo caves, but the shadows were no longer hungry. They were just shadows again. The weaver stood before her, no longer a giant of starlight, but a woman about the height of a tall gnome, wearing a cloak made of shifting autumn leaves. "Root collector," the weaver said, touching Thistle's shoulder. "You brought the hearth to the void. You have saved more than just the seasons." She reached into the air and pulled out a single thread of pure, glowing amber. She tied it around Thistle's wrist. "This is the loom link," the weaver said. "It will tell you when the forest needs you. But for now, I think someone is waking up in your pocket." Thistle reached into her bag. The season sprite, once gray and cold, was now glowing with a fierce, brilliant gold. It flew up and began to dance around Thistle's head, chirping with joy. "Go home, Thistle," the weaver smiled. "The forest is ready to sleep now, a proper, healthy sleep." Walk back from the echo caves was the quietest journey Thistle had ever taken, but it was a good quiet. The air no longer felt like a clock wound too tight. It felt like a soft pillow. As she stepped out of the cave's mouth, she saw that the silver ash had vanished, replaced by a light dusting of real, crystalline frost. The forest had finally remembered how to be cold. The season sprite zipped ahead of her, its golden light trailing behind like a silk ribbon. Every time the sprite brushed against a tree, the bark seemed to settle, the sap slowing down for the winter slumber. When Thistle reached the drowsy thicket, the slumber berries were no longer shriveled. They were plump, glowing with a soft indigo light, and smelling of deep, dreamless rest. She saw a family of wood mice curled up in a nest of dried grass, their tiny sides heaving in a perfect rhythmic sleep. "The world is dreaming again," Thistle whispered, feeling a wave of exhaustion finally hit her own bones. She reached her home tree, the Great Cedar, just as the moon was rising. The gatekeeper was gone from the stump, but in his place sat a small, carved wooden bowl filled with steaming, liched seed soup, and a note written on a birch leaf. "The roots are satisfied. Eat, sleep. The loom is steady." Thistle climbed her mossy stairs, her boots feeling heavier with every step. She entered her amber-glass sanctuary, set her badger leather bag on the driftwood table, and hung her green hat on its peg. But as she reached for her mug, she noticed something strange. On her table, right where she had left her hazelnut milk, was a small, pulsing object. It wasn't the silver spindle, and it wasn't a root. It was a seed of shadow. It looked like a piece of polished coal, but it was translucent, and inside, a tiny gray flame was flickering. It was a remnant of the shadow loom. Thistle sat down, her heart quickening. Had the illusion not been fully destroyed? She touched the seed, and a vision flashed through her mind. not of a gray, empty forest, but of a distant, iron city where the trees were made of metal and the sky was permanently choked with smoke. It was a place where the never was had become the always is. The loom link on her wrist, the amber thread given by the weaver, began to glow. The mystery hasn't ended, she realized. It has just moved. The seed wasn't a threat. It was a distress signal. The shadow loom hadn't been an enemy to defeat, but a symptom of a deeper wound far beyond the borders of Oakhaven. Somewhere, in the lands of the tall folk, the connection to the earth had been severed so completely that the instead of was leaking into the world of the gnomes. Thistle looked at her cozy bed, then at the glowing seed. She thought of her life as a root collector, safe in the mid-trunk. She could bury the seed in the dirt and forget about it. She could let the weaver handle the distant shadows. But then she looked at the season sprite, which had curled up inside her tea caddy, its light dimming as it prepared for its own winter rest. The sprite had sacrificed its glow for her in the vortex. The weaver had trusted her with the hearth scent. A root collector finds what is buried, she reminded herself. She didn't go to bed. Instead, she took her silver trowel and a fresh, empty scent jar. She placed the shadow seed inside the jar and sealed it. If the shadows were coming from a place with no smell, she would have to bring the fragrance of Oakhaven to the Iron City. She packed a new bag. This time, she didn't just take tools. She took seeds, acorns from the great oak, keys from the maple, and a single, shimmering needle from the silver birch spire. She stepped back out onto her porch. The forest was asleep, bathed in the silver-blue light of the winter moon. It was a perfect, peaceful moment. "Sleep well, Oakhaven," Thistle whispered. "I'll bring the spring back when it's time." She didn't take the dew slide down. She walked the stairs, one deliberate step at a time, heading toward the northern border where the trees grew thin and the air began to smell of cold iron. The great weaving was only just beginning. The gray borderlands were a place where the map of the world seemed to fray at the edges. As Thistle crossed the final ridge of Oakhaven, the vibrant green and deep browns of her home didn't just fade. They felt as if they were being bleached by a relentless, invisible sun. The trees here were stunted, their branches reaching upward like skeletal fingers, and the moss was a brittle, dusty gray that crunched like dried bone beneath her boots. There was no birdsong here. The only sound was the low, metallic moan of the wind as it whistled through the gaps in the crags. Thistle gripped the strap of her bag. The shadow seed in its jar was pulsing more rapidly now, the tiny gray flame inside flickering in the direction of the horizon. "Steady," she whispered to herself. She reached into her pocket and touched the loom link on her wrist. The amber thread was her only connection to the warmth of the hearth. As she descended into the valley, she encountered the border warden. He was not a gnome, but a creature made of discarded things, rusted wire, smooth river stones, and patches of old leather. He sat atop a pile of iron slag, his eyes two glowing amber embers that reminded Thistle of her own lantern. "Small traveler, large burden," the warden creaked. His voice sounded like a door with rusted hinges. "The forest behind you is a dream. The world ahead of you is a factory. Why do you walk toward the smoke?" "I carry a seed that doesn't belong," Thistle replied, holding up the jar. "And I carry the scent of a world that refuses to be forgotten." The warden tilted his head, his wire mesh neck clicking. "The Iron City does not have ears for the forest. It has gears. It has pistons. It has a grand artificer who believes that nature is a mistake that needs to be corrected with steel." "No mistake is so large that a root cannot find a crack in it," Thistle said firmly. The warden let out a sound that might have been a laugh. "Then you will need the oil of silence. The Iron City lives on friction. If they hear your heart beating, they will try to catch it in a spring." He reached into his chest, which was a hollow bird cage, and pulled out a small, blackened flask. "Rub this on your boots. It will make your steps as quiet as a falling leaf. But be warned, the silence of the city is not like the silence of the woods. In the city, silence is just a lack of power." Thistle took the flask. The oil smelled of cold grease and old pennies. She applied it to her boots, and immediately the thwip-thwip of her walking vanished. She moved across the gravel like a ghost. As she moved further into the borderlands, the sky began to change. The blue was replaced by a heavy, bruised purple, and then a thick, suffocating charcoal. Great chimneys appeared on the horizon, taller than the silver birch spire, belching clouds of soot that blotted out the stars. The ground was no longer earth. It was paved with cinder blocks, cold artificial stones that held no memory of the rain. Thistle felt a wave of nausea. Her green sight was screaming. To her eyes, the world here looked like a giant wounded animal covered in a suit of armor. She opened her jar of earth after rain just a crack, taking a tiny sip of the scent to keep her spirit from wilting. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her. Not a soft tree shadow, but a sharp, mechanical one. A patrol drone, a brass orb with whirring blades and a single red glass eye, descended from the smog. It clicked and whirred, its lens zooming in on the glowing amber thread on her wrist. "Unauthorized vibration detected," the drone buzzed in a voice of flat, grating tin. "Nature sign detected. Cease growth immediately." Thistle froze. The drone lowered a spindly metal claw, reaching for her bag. But Thistle was a root collector. She knew that the best way to deal with a hard surface was to find its join. She didn't run. She reached into her bag and pulled out a handful of quick-grow fern seeds she had brought from the drowsy thicket. She didn't throw them at the drone. She threw them into the tiny exhaust vent at the back of its brass shell. "The forest doesn't cease," she whispered. Within seconds, the warmth of the drone's engine triggered the seeds. Thick green fronds erupted from the vents, their powerful roots tangling in the gears. The drone let out a confused bloop. Its red eye flickered to a soft green, and it drifted harmlessly to the ground, covered in a sudden, lush wig of ferns. Thistle didn't wait to see if it would wake up. She hurried forward, the iron city looming ahead of her like a mountain of rust. She was no longer just a gnome in the woods. She was a spark of life in a world of cold metal. The Iron City was a labyrinth of verticality and steam. Unlike the Great Cedar, where the stairs were made of living moss and soft wood, the city was a jagged climb of rusted iron grates and hissing pipes. Everything smelled of burnt coal and hot oil. The sky was not a roof here. It was a lid, heavy and gray, pressing down on the narrow alleys. Thistle moved through the shadows of the lower gears, her boots made silent by the warden's oil. Above her, massive pistons hammered with a rhythm that felt like a headache. Clang hiss, clang hiss. This was the heartbeat of a world that had forgotten how to breathe. The shadow seed in her jar was glowing with a frantic silver heat now. It wasn't pointing forward anymore. It was pointing down toward a massive circular structure at the city's center. The Garden of Gears. Thistle squeezed through a gap in a ventilation duct and found herself on a high catwalk overlooking the garden. It was a heartbreaking sight. It was a vast, domed hall designed to look like a forest, but everything in it was a mechanical imitation. The trees were pillars of copper with brass leaves that clicked in a manufactured breeze. The flowers were made of stained glass, their petals opening and closing with the sound of clockwork. In the center, inside a cage of electrified silver wire, sat the source of the city's power, the captured heart of the wild. It was a massive, ancient root, larger than a house, that had been ripped from the earth and encased in metal. Wires were pierced into its bark like leeches, draining its golden life force to power the city's endless machines. "Oh, old friend," Thistle whispered, tears pricking her eyes. The root was gray, its pulse so weak it was almost invisible. Standing before the cage was the Grand Artificer. He was a man encased in a suit of polished steel, his face hidden behind a mask of glass and brass. He held a golden needle, a perverted version of the weaver's shuttle, and was injecting a thick, violet fluid into the root. "Stagnation is safety," the artificer's voice echoed through the hall, amplified by brass speakers. "By controlling the growth, we eliminate the decay. A world that does not change is a world that cannot die." Thistle realized the shadow loom hadn't just been an accident. The artificer had been milking the forest's frustration, using the energy of the seasons that couldn't change to fuel his iron empire. She looked at the shadow seed in her hand. It wasn't a weapon of destruction. It was a piece of the root's own stolen sorrow. "I have to give it back," she said to the season sprite, who was peeking out from her collar. "The sorrow belongs to the root, so the joy can return." She began her descent, climbing down a series of chains. She reached the floor of the garden, dodging the mechanical sentinels, spider-like robots that skittered across the copper leaves. She reached the silver cage. The air here was humming with a dangerous, high-pitched tension. The artificer was gone, retreated to a high balcony to monitor the injection cycle. Thistle took out her silver trowel. She didn't strike the cage. She knew the electricity would kill her. Instead, she looked at the base of the metal floor. Even here, in the heart of the machine, there were cracks. The city was built on the earth, and the earth was patient. She uncorked her final jar. The first breath of spring. She poured the scent into a crack in the metal floor. "Wake up," she commanded. "The sky is clear in Oakhaven. The weaver is back at her loom." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the metal floor began to vibrate. Not the vibration of a machine, but the heave of a giant waking up. A tiny, real green sprout, a descendant of the seeds she had scattered earlier, pushed through the crack. It grew with impossible speed, fueled by the concentrated scent of spring. The vine wrapped around the silver cage, its green body acting as a natural insulator against the electricity. Thistle reached through the gap the vine had created. She pressed the jar with the shadow seed against the gray, leathery bark of the great root. "Return to the hole," she whispered. She shattered the jar. The moment the shadow seed touched the root, the gray flame didn't burn. It dissolved. The root let out a sound that wasn't a hum or a groan. It was a sob. A massive, released wave of emotion rippled through the hall. The violet fluid in the tubes turned back to gold. The leeches, the metal wires, began to pop out of the bark as the root swelled with renewed life. "Trespasser!" the artificer screamed from above. "You are reintroducing chaos." "It's not chaos," Thistle shouted back, her voice ringing with the authority of the mid-trunk. "It's the truth." The great root began to glow with a blinding amber light. The copper trees in the garden started to melt, their clockwork hearts unable to handle the sudden surge of real, unbridled growth. Thistle grabbed her bag and the season sprite. "Hang on, little spark. The forest is coming home." The Garden of Gears was no longer a place of cold calculation. It was a scene of beautiful, terrifying eruption. The great root, now reconnected to its own history of sorrow and joy, began to pulse like a massive drum. With every beat, cracks spiderwebbed across the iron floor, and from those cracks, the earth surged upward to reclaim its own. Greenery didn't just grow, it exploded. Ivy as thick as a gnome's waist coiled around the steam pipes, crushing them until they hissed out their last breath of artificial heat. The brass leaves of the mechanical trees were shaken off by a sudden, wild wind that smelled of pine needles and ancient soil. "The system is failing!" the Grand Artificer screamed, his steel suit clattering as he stumbled on the balcony. "The order! The stability! You are destroying everything!" "I'm waking it up," Thistle countered. She felt a surge of energy through the loom link on her wrist. The amber thread was glowing so fiercely, it looked like she was wearing a ring of fire. The great root heaved one final time. The silver cage didn't just break, it vanished, consumed by the sheer radiance of the root's life force. Freed from its shackles, the root began to descend. It didn't move physically. It began to sink back into the spiritual layer of the world, pulling the energy of the Iron City with it. "Thistle! The anchor!" the seasoned sprite chirped, its voice now a resonant bell tone. The sprite pointed toward the base of the root. A massive, swirling vortex of golden energy and brown earth had opened. This was the Deep Path, a direct tunnel back to the heart of the world. But it was unstable. The metal of the city was fighting the transition, creating steel spikes of jagged energy that threatened to shred the root as it passed. Thistle realized she couldn't just watch. She was a root collector. She knew how to guide a sprout through stony ground. She ran toward the vortex, her silent boots leaping over buckling metal plates. She took the Owl King's feather and the silver trowel and held them aloft. "By the oak and the ash," she cried, "by the hearth and the home, soften the iron and let the life-blood roam." She used the trowel to sculpt the energy. Where the steel was sharp, she directed a wave of moss energy to coat it. Where the pipes were hot, she called upon the memory of the silver birch spire to bring a cooling frost. The great root began to slide into the vortex. As it moved, it took Thistle with it. She felt a sensation of falling, but it wasn't the terrifying drop of the High-Vantage. It was the warm, dark embrace of being planted. Around her, the Iron City was transforming. The Garden of Gears was becoming a literal garden. The artificer's balcony was overgrown with wild roses, their thorns piercing his steel suit, pinning him harmlessly to the wall as he stared in silent wonder. The smoke from the chimneys turned into clouds of white pollen. As Thistle and the root sank deeper into the earth, the metallic roar of the city faded, replaced by the deep, rhythmic hum of the lower green. She saw the energy veins she had heard about in stories, the glowing rivers of gold and violet that fed every blade of grass in Oakhaven. The great root found its old socket. With a sound of 1,000 sighs, it locked back into the world's foundation. Thistle stood in the center of the subterranean glow. The season sprite landed on the root, its light now a permanent, steady gold. The great weaver appeared for a fleeting second, her starlight hair brushing against Thistle's cheek. "The circle is mended, little collector," the weaver whispered. "The world will still have its iron, but the iron will now know the law of the leaf." Thistle felt a wave of peace so profound she closed her eyes. When she opened them, she wasn't in the deep path anymore. She was standing on the northern ridge of Oakhaven. The sun was rising, but it wasn't the bruised purple of the city. It was a crisp winter gold. Looking back toward the horizon, she saw the Iron City. It was still there, but the black chimneys were gone. In their place stood a forest of green towers, their windows reflecting the morning light like dew on a spiderweb. The "instead of" had become the "is." Thistle reached into her bag. It was empty of seeds and jars, but it felt heavier than ever. She pulled out a small, smooth stone she had picked up in the Garden of Gears. It was no longer cold iron. It was a piece of petrified wood, pulsing with a faint, warm light. She turned and began the walk back to her cedar home. Her boots made a happy thwip-thwip on the fresh snow. The walk back to the heart of Oakhaven was a victory lap of the senses. The air was no longer a battleground of seasons. It was a crisp, clear winter morning that knew exactly what it was. The frost on the ferns looked like intricate lace, and for the first time in weeks, Thistle heard the rhythmic thump-thump of a woodpecker, a sound that felt like the forest's own heartbeat returning to a steady pace. As she reached the Whispering Well, she found the gatekeeper waiting. He didn't look like a gnarled piece of wood anymore. His lichen beard was lush and green, and his tortoise-shell hat sat straight on his head. "You look taller, Thistle," he noted, a wide smile crinkling his aged face. "I think I just feel the weight of the sky a little differently now," she replied. She reached into her bag and showed him the petrified wood she had brought back from the Iron City. "The iron has a heartbeat now, gatekeeper." The old gnome nodded slowly. "The great weaving is never truly finished, but the knots have been untied. You've done more than collect roots. You've planted a new kind of hope." Thistle finally arrived at the base of her Great Cedar. She climbed the mossy spiral stairs, her muscles aching with a tiredness that felt like a warm blanket. When she stepped into her amber glass sanctuary, the sunlight was pouring in, turning the room into a chamber of molten honey. She sat at her driftwood table. The hazelnut milk she had left behind was long gone, but she didn't mind. She took out her silver trowel and placed it in its velvet-lined box. It was nicked and scratched, a record of every hard surface it had faced. Beside it, she laid the Owl King's feather and the silver spindle. The season sprite didn't return to the tea caddy. It flew to the window, watching a pair of squirrels leap through the branches. With a final, grateful chirp, it vanished into a burst of golden sparks, merging back into the forest's essence. Its mission was over. Thistle leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She thought of the Iron City, now blooming with greenery, and the great weaver, whose hands were once again steady. She thought of the mid-trunk, her quiet life, and the tea of clarity she would brew tomorrow. Through the floorboards, she felt the Great Cedar hum. It wasn't a shiver of fear or a pulse of anxiety. It was a deep, resonant song of gratitude. The roots were drinking deep, the sap was resting, and the world was preparing for a spring that would be unlike any other. A spring that had been fought for and won. Thistle reached up and untied the loom link from her wrist. The amber thread didn't disappear. It simply became a part of her skin, a faint, shimmering line that would always remind her that she was connected to everything, from the deepest root to the highest star. "Good night, Oakhaven," she whispered. She didn't wait for the moon to rise. She climbed into her swan-down bed, pulled up the thick wool blankets, and fell into a sleep so deep and so peaceful that not even the shadow loom could have touched it. The root collector was home, and for the first time in a very long time, the forest was truly, beautifully, and safely asleep.